Hello, everyone. Good morning. This is Blaine Kaho'onei. Just wanted to reach out to some of the attendees that are already on the line, ready to go for this morning's or maybe this afternoon's webinar series. Start kicking off with Cervello. I'm going to wait for a few minutes before we get started, just to make sure we get other kind of stragglers and attendees joining. So probably get started with our webinar about 5 after. So thank you so much. All right, looks like we have a few more people that have joined us. So I think maybe what we'll do is go ahead and get started. Great. So it looks like about 20 some odd people have joined in. All right, well, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining today's first in a series of webinars that we're publishing called our Heroku Partner Patterns. We're kicking off the webinar series with one of our longtime partners, Cervello, who's been a longtime advocate of Salesforce, as well as Heroku as part of the Salesforce platform. Just as a quick introduction, my name is Blaine Kaho'onei. I am the partner business development manager for Heroku, and I manage all of the consulting partnerships across the Americas here. I have joining us today my counterparts at Cervello, Peter Graham and Jason Reed, and what we're going to do is kind of speak with you today about some of the one of the most common kind of challenges that we've seen customers have as they continue to grow their business using Salesforce as an investment to manage their business, with CRM. And given that, I'll hand over the reins to to both Peter and Jason, and let them kind of introduce themselves and carry on from there on the agenda.
Great, thanks, Blaine. So again, this is Pete Graham from Cervello. I'm a VP and I run our Salesforce practice here at Cervello. I'm joined by Jason Reed, who's also a manager and a solution architect within the Salesforce practice here at Cervello. So just to review the agenda we're going to run through, I'm going to start with a quick introduction about who Cervello is, and then we're going to dive right into the topic. So we'll cover, as Blaine mentioned, what are some challenges that organizations are facing in regards to managing data on the Salesforce platform. We'll touch upon the Heroku Platform specifically and how it can help address this challenge. And then we'll dive right into the Cervello architecture, archiving solution architecture. I'll cover a couple of case studies and use cases, and then Jason's going to walk us through a demo, and then we'll wrap up around a call to action, and we'll have some Q&A. So while we are going through the presentation today, if you want to be logging your questions in the GoToMeeting console, we'll be monitoring those, and then we'll summarize them at the end and hopefully address as much as we can before the hour's up. So before we get started, let me just share a little bit of background about Cervello. So we are a leading Salesforce partner, and we go to market around 3 core service areas of our business from a services perspective. The first is CRM, which for us is 100% focused on the Salesforce platform, and that includes implementing Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, Marketing Cloud, communities, and we have specialization in the Einstein Analytics and Heroku Platform, which we're speaking about today. In addition to that, we do help organizations around their business intelligence analytics needs and enterprise performance management, which is solutions that fall within Office of Finance, typically around financial reporting, budgeting, and planning. And underlying all that, each of those areas, we help organizations develop their modern data architecture that helps support, organize, and integrate that data across each one of these platforms and solutions that we provide. We do have a bit of an industry focus in some areas, and our footprint is we have 4 regional offices and 2 offshore development centers outside the US. So let's start with what are some of the challenges that organizations are facing when it comes to managing data on the Salesforce platform. Obviously, Salesforce is being heavily utilized in some of the core use cases in sales, service, marketing, communities. And each one of these obviously can generate a significant amount of data, depending on the functionality that's been implemented along with the business processes being addressed. And that can be both in B2B or B2C type organizations. In addition to that, there are some other areas that obviously can significantly add additional data to the org. So that could be in the areas of e-commerce, analytics, building out customer-facing apps, or IoT use cases with connected products. And so in all of these, we're creating a significant amount of data that's being moved into the Salesforce org and needs to be managed. And the challenge with this is that, with that data being created, what's the right balance that an organization should make, and trade-offs they should make with what data they need to keep in the Salesforce platform versus what data they might need to move off or archive. And unfortunately, a lot of organizations are choosing the decision to delete that data in many ways, just as an easy way to reduce the storage on the Salesforce platform. And obviously, by deleting that data, we're losing some value that the organization can have. So this is definitely a pain point that we're hearing a lot of organizations that we're working with and talking to on a day-to-day basis. So there are a set of drivers also in addition to just data storage that we're seeing that do need to be addressed. And so let me just take a moment to walk through a couple of those areas that we see and that we're hearing. So obviously the first is reducing the data storage. So we see organizations that, through the growth of the organization, the expansion of how they're utilizing the platform, the Salesforce platform, that there might be a small handful of objects that are generating a significant amount of the data storage requirements. So you might think of that as being maybe a heavy amount of transactional type data. And so that's something that needs to be addressed through an archiving solution. In addition to that, there might also be some performance constraints. So, again, somewhat related to the first driver, but the ability to retrieve, view, report on that data when you have millions and millions of records can certainly impact the performance and the response time from an end user perspective. Another area that we see is around regulatory requirements. So if you think of industries such as life sciences or financial services, there are going to be some regulations from an audit purposes perspective that need to be adhered to. And so that can be a driver of needing an archiving solution. The next area is, having a good data retention policy in place. So a lot of organizations have policies that might require storing and persisting data going back 7 years, but they also need a mechanism to potentially purge that data if need be. And then finally, integrating that data from an archiving perspective into other data assets. So if we think about the Salesforce platform, be it the data that's live in the system or potentially archived, how might we take that data and integrate it into other areas of the organization? So assets such as data marts, data warehouse, data lakes, et cetera. So these are some of the drivers. So when we combine all those together, we know that we need a scalable platform that we can easily integrate that Salesforce platform and data and provide the right tools to be able to meet those needs individually or potentially collectively. So these might be all drivers that organizations are facing. So again, this is where we believe Heroku is a great fit as a scalable platform to help address this data need. So if you're not familiar with Heroku, it's a platform as a service that runs on the Amazon Web Services cloud and provides the ability to build scalable apps to be able to extend the CRM. The types of applications that can be built include things like customer-facing apps, be it mobile, web-based, or in the case of archiving, what we'd refer to as data-driven apps. So what makes Heroku a bit meaningful and powerful is its ability to connect to the Salesforce platform. So having the ability to easily integrate data from the CRM via Heroku Connect and build services that can perform very data-intensive processes, such as archiving, makes it a good fit. So with that, what we refer to as on-demand nature of the computing resources that we can make available on Heroku, it allows you or me as a developer to be able to scale up or down my application based on the types of usage you need to use. So an example with archiving being a bit cyclical, where you might archive on a periodic basis, it's a good use case to leverage those on-demand services. So this is why we believe Heroku is a very good fit, and one of the reasons why we decided to build out this solution on the platform, along with some of the services that we get from Heroku. So if you think about Heroku Postgres, that gives us the ability to store and persist data, the development environment to build our application logic, and then Heroku Connect, which gives us that integration back to the Salesforce platform. So let me now walk through what the architecture is of the solution that we're gonna talk through today and demo. So if we start out, we have obviously our Salesforce environment and our Heroku environment set up. The first thing we have in the architecture is we're leveraging Heroku Connect. So what Heroku Connect is going to allow us to do is bidirectionally sync objects from Salesforce back into Postgres, which is Postgres, if you're not familiar, is a relational database. So what that gives us is the ability to, on the Heroku side, be able to access the data that we've synchronized to the Salesforce platform. It also keeps that data updated and synchronized as new records are inserted, updated, or deleted on Salesforce. Those would be synchronized immediately to the Heroku platform, and vice versa. If we were to make those changes on the Heroku side, those would be synchronized back up to Salesforce. So once we have that established, our application is then running in both Salesforce, and our archiving engine is running in Heroku. So on the Salesforce side, we have a series of admin interfaces where, as an administrator, you can define the archiving rules, which objects need to be archived, on what frequency, what the condition is that you would archive based on, such as time or some attribute related to the record itself. And that interface would call out to our archiving engine that's running on the Heroku platform. And that would make requests to either run an archiving routine or an unarchiving routine. One important aspect of this architecture is that the heavy lifting itself for the archiving process is running on the Heroku platform, and we're minimizing the impact on the Salesforce platform as much as possible, such that we don't hit or impact governor limits and things like that. In addition to that, we take advantage of dynos. So dynos are basically processing units that are power or computing resources. So we're taking care of those, taking advantage of those within the architecture. And then we have add-ons or elements that we can add into our application. So for example, we're using an add-on called RabbitMQ as a queuing engine in this application architecture. And then finally, we can introduce Salesforce Connect. So as much as it's nice to move that data and the archive data off platform, it's still important to be able to gain access to that. So one of the components of the architecture is exposing the archive data as external objects, which is through OData, and being able to access that through Salesforce Connect, which allows us to view and access that data like any other object on the Salesforce platform. And so from an end user perspective, I still have the ability to access that data. I'm just not persisting it anymore on the Salesforce platform. So let me now walk through a very simple use case of how archiving works. And I've simplified it down. It's a lot more complex than what I'm going to walk through here, but I think it will give folks an understanding of what we mean by using Heroku Connect to synchronize data and how to archive that off the platform. So if we start with Salesforce and we think about having an account object within the Salesforce environment, over time that object obviously is going to fill up with records. So I might create 1 million account records within my Salesforce environment. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to establish a connection with Heroku via Heroku Connect. And again, that's going to bidirectionally synchronize those records back to Postgres and back into what we refer to as the Connect table. So once that's done, I'll have those 1 million records that are synchronized into the account Connect table on Heroku. Once I have that in place, we establish, and this is again as part of our application, we establish a shadow copy or a shadow view or a table structure, I should say, of that account object. And we refer to this as an archive table. And then I'll typically set up some sort of rule that says I want to archive these types of records. So in this example, we might archive account records that are greater than 2 years old and have a status of inactive. And so that might move, say, half the records from that Connect table into that archive table. Once that copy is completed, we request to delete those records out of Connect table. Those records are removed. Heroku Connect will see those deletes, synchronize that back up to Salesforce, and reduce the storage back down to the half a million records on the Salesforce side. So this is the concept, and this is actually what our application is able to do and manage. Now, it's a very simple use case, so let me talk a little bit more in detail about what are some of the complexities that go along with this. So the first area is just the Salesforce data model. So my example earlier was one account. Well, the reality, or an account object, the reality is that accounts have other data related to it. And so I think about things like contacts, opportunities, custom objects. I need to be able to manage all of those together when I archive, say an account. So it's important to understand that and manage that. The next thing, sort of building off of that, is the ability to maintain object relationships. So one of the aspects of the solution that we've built is we can carry along the related objects, but also maintaining their relationships to each other. And so that might be maintaining those relationships directly in the archive data, or it could also include extending that back to data that's still persisted or stored in my Salesforce environment. So for example, if I archive a series of contacts, but not the account associated with it, I still want to make sure I can relate that contact back to the account that's sitting in Salesforce. In addition to that, managing and understanding how Salesforce treats deletion operations and the impact in the two areas of both cascade deletes and restricted deletes is very important. So as we look at the configuration of the archiving solution, it's important to understand the impact of archiving a single type of object. So if it's a master detail, does the detail records need to be archived also with it, or should they be deleted and lost? And then restricted deletes around objects like cases and opportunities. The other key is an ability to be able to execute an unarchived routine, or think about this as recreating these records back into Salesforce. So it could be a unique use case, but we've seen some of our customers that do have this requirement where what they'll want to do is maybe they've archived off a customer and all the related history about that customer. That customer re-engages. They want to bring that history on all the related data about that customer back into Salesforce. We actually can rebuild those structures and those records back into the Salesforce platform. Another key aspect, again, when we think about running an archiving routine efficiently, as we could be dealing with millions and millions of records, is making sure that we're managing those archiving processes end to end, and that we can actually bring those through. And when errors do occur, how do we essentially recover from those errors? API callouts are always going to be something that we need to deal with. One of the advantages here is that we're leveraging Heroku Connect, which does not actually count against API callouts. So those would be considered whitelisted. So if I'm synchronizing 100 million rows of data between Salesforce and Heroku, that is not going to count against my daily API callouts. And then finally is governor limits, and I sort of touched upon this earlier, but one of the key aspects of our architecture is that the heavy lifting or the heavy data processing that's occurring is all happening on the Heroku platform. And so although we are executing a delete operation back up through Heroku Connect, we are not doing any of the logic and heavy lifting of an archiving routine on the Salesforce platform, and that's important not to impede the daily operations of the Salesforce users. So this is altogether what we've essentially packaged up into our archiving accelerator. So we've packaged up a solution. As I said, we have some interfaces in Salesforce, and then our application engine that's running in the Heroku platform. So let me share now just 3 customer use cases or case study examples, just to give you a sense for the types of application that we can apply this to, and the types of data volumes that obviously can be addressed. So in the first use case, we were working with a customer who had about 16 years of case data in their Salesforce environment, which was about 35 million records of total case and related child records to those cases. Fairly complex environment. And so the use case here was obviously to reduce the storage, meet some retention policies that the organization had in place, along with ultimately improving performance by reducing the number of records in the Salesforce environment. And again, directly related to service agents and their ability to access case records going forward. So that's the first one. Second one is a custom in-home healthcare assessment tool that a customer built out. And again, this is, if you think about doing like a survey type environment, you can imagine you've got a lot of questions, a lot of answers, and a lot of constituents where you're completing these for. So these assessments will be done on an individual level. So they were generating a significant amount of data. So we had close to 150 million total records within the Salesforce environment that we needed to archive. But we also needed to be able to support an unarchiving use case. So as I mentioned earlier, bringing that data back into the Salesforce platform. So that had a direct reduction in about close to 300 gigabytes of storage. And again, it's going to be an ongoing process for them going forward. And then finally, we have a nonprofit use case where, again, a very large number of records being generated through campaigns. And they obviously want to move those records off platform, but still have access to update them. So when a donation is made, they want to be able to update that original campaign member, which might be in an archived state. And so again, using the ability to get access to that data from the Salesforce Connect was a key critical part to that. And again, significant data reduction from a storage perspective. So those were three good examples of applying the archiving use case. So before we dive into a demo that Jason's going to walk us through, let me just actually talk about 3 reference architectures. Again, use cases for managing data. So let me talk through what does the architecture look like for, say, managing and reducing data storage. Second one, which would be about related to unarchiving records back into Salesforce. And the third and final around, how do I extend the platform to other data within the organization? So again, use case number 1, reducing data storage. So this would be the scenario where maybe you're exceeding your allotted storage that Salesforce has based on the number of users you have in your organization. So in this example, we're exceeding our allotted storage by 187%, which is a significant amount. So almost double what I was allocated. So this is again a perfect example where we can apply the archiving use case and essentially target maybe a set of objects that might be driving that. One of the things that we typically find is that it's actually a small number of objects that actually might be driving 80 to 90% of the storage overages. And so it's a very simple use case to get set up. What we find is actually the ability to configure that scenario is very low complexity, because again, if it's only one or two objects, there's not a lot of child relationships that need to be dealt with. So the second use case, and I talked to this a little bit earlier, would be around bringing data back into the Salesforce environment. Exact same architecture, exact same solution, and the only difference here is that we need to unwind the process. So one of the key aspects of this is you think about it, when I unarchive, I need to start with, say, my account record first before I can bring in my contact records. So again, this is actually one aspect of our solution that we were able to address. We can both archive and unarchive the same data and the same relationships. And then finally, we think about how do we extend that data outside of just the archiving use case to what other ways can we leverage the Heroku platform? So in this example, we might want to think about, okay, I've got this both archived and unarchived data. I want to bring in data from another operational system, so say my ERP, into that Postgres environment. I want to model that data, and then I want to give users or analysts or power users the ability to access it. And again, that might be one way would be simply through data clips, which is a capability within the Heroku platform. And this gives you this ability to write reports and queries and then share those out. And again, a little bit focused towards power users, or using that as the basis to bring it into something like Einstein Analytics. So Einstein Analytics has hooks directly into Heroku Postgres. I have that data, I can bring it in, I can build visualizations, dashboards, et cetera, and build some more robust analytics that can be distributed out within the organization. So with that, I'm going to transition. We're going to do a pass over to Jason. What he's going to do is actually walk through an actual demo. And I just want to remind folks, if you can continue to submit your questions, if you have any, we'll make sure at the end we'll have time to wrap up on those. So Jason?
Yes, hi everyone. So what I'll be walking through today is just a simple use case of using our archiver from the user or admin's perspective. There is the whole kind of Heroku component, which we can talk in other sessions, but today we'll be just kind of operating within that Salesforce environment that Pete had talked about. So just to start, what I'll be doing is I'll be taking an account, and let me bring up the account here. We'll be taking our Cervello International account. Go ahead and view the account hierarchy. And we'll be taking a subset of the hierarchy, specifically Cervello United States, and archiving that set of data. And we're going to set it up so that way everything that's a child object related to account or contact is going to get archived with it. And then what we're going to do, we're going to view that in an archived state using Salesforce Connect. And then we're going to unarchive it and bring it back into Salesforce as if it never left. The only thing that's going to change in this process is the Salesforce IDs, which kind of needs to happen if we're going to release that Salesforce storage space. So to start this process, what we have here is you'll see we have this application configured, the DB Archiver. And this is really just an app that we'll set up in your org. We have something that we can start with out of the box, but all of it is customizable. This isn't a managed package or unmanaged package. It acts a lot like an unmanaged package in that it's just an application with some tabs in our custom code that ultimately interacts with the Heroku backend. So I'm going to go ahead and start here. I'm going to jump into our bulk jobs manager. I'm going to first configure the archiver to be able to essentially archive the relationships in a way that we want. So the way we do that is with our relationship manager tab. And when you first come to this tab, you'll be presented with a list of objects. And all of these objects will be the objects that are currently under sync in Heroku Connect. Throughout this application, you'll see that we just piggyback on top of Heroku Connect. If you're syncing in Heroku Connect, our application will see that object and its fields. So because I'm going to be archiving the account object, what I'm going to want to do is configure it to archive child accounts and child contacts. So you can see here when I selected the account, it presents me with a list of relationships that are available for child relationship archiving. Again, as I mentioned, it looks at all the relationships that it sees in Postgres and in Heroku Connect. So the account object could have more relationships outside of this, but this is something we usually do with our clients, walk through their orgs to understand what relationships the account object has and what we should kind of bring inside of Heroku Connect for archiving. Some of the other things we kind of bring to light here is cascade deletes and delete restrictions. Cascade deletes are important because obviously if we're archiving a parent record, anything beneath that, as Pete mentioned, will get deleted as well. So we'll make sure, if you check off any of these boxes, we'll archive that before the cascade delete process runs. Deletion restricted, as Pete said, in some cases, some objects that are child objects can prevent the archiving of the parent. We've configured it here right now just for child accounts and contacts, so it's pretty much, that's all it requires is just checking some boxes. If I wanted to archive child objects beneath contacts or accounts, you can continue and cascade down the entire relationship hierarchy. So now I'm going to start the archiving process, and there's really two ways in which you can do that we make available. One is through the Archiving Manager tab, and this tab lets you target specific records that you want to archive. More often than not, our clients will use the Bulk Jobs Manager because more often than not, you really want to archive records in bulk. So in the Bulk Jobs Manager tab, again, this is just something kind of out of the box that we put together. You can customize this as need be, but you'll start by selecting the object name. Which object do you want to archive? In our case, we'll be archiving account. You select the job type, so whether or not you're archiving or unarchiving. And then you'll have a condition statement here that defines what set of records you want to archive. And this is a PostgreSQL condition, so you're going to be able to use a lot of the functions and operators that are available in Postgres. So you can see down here in one of our examples, we use the datepart function to archive sets of accounts that kind of fall within the created date by year. Anything that you can write in PostgreSQL in a where clause, you can write that here. All this, when it's queried and processed, will happen on the Heroku backend, so it makes it really lightweight on the Salesforce side and doesn't consume any resources. I'm going to go ahead and pull up one of our configs down here that we've already set up for the account object, and I'm going to switch this to archiving. We provide some other capabilities as well. You can check the condition to see how many records will be impacted by this statement, so that way you're aware of how many records you could potentially be archiving or unarchiving. And we do have some capabilities around cron expressions where you can schedule jobs. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And now my config is down here below. And you can have multiple configs per object if you want to run the archiving or unarchiving based on different scenarios. So I'm going to go ahead and click Run the Job here. It'll ask me if I want to confirm that. I'll then be presented with the job log ID, and this will always display the last job log ID of the last process that ran for that config, whether it was scheduled or manual. You can also access our job logs tab here to see a complete list of all the jobs that were ran. And what you'll see happening here is our process is booting up in the back end and starting to archive those 4 accounts and all the contacts that fall beneath those accounts. Our archiver right now, when we've stress tested it, it's been with we've archived probably, a few million records with a very simple kind of hierarchy structure of a parent account with a few children, and we clocked it somewhere between 300 and 400,000 records per hour. That can vary greatly based on your org, the relationships involved, the code in your org. So that's something we'll definitely walk through with you, if you were to engage with us. So you can see it's completed here. In about 20, 30 seconds, it'll give an output of the number of records that were archived by type of object. And just to confirm that these were archived, let's jump in here to Cervello International. We'll come down here, view our hierarchy, and we'll see that Cervello United States is no longer there, along with all of its child accounts and contacts. So now that it's in an archive state, I have a couple of options here in terms of viewing it. I can either go and connect directly to my Postgres database through various database admin tools. I can use data clips, as Pete mentioned, to go and query it. But for our case, we're going to stay within the Salesforce environment here, and we're going to use Salesforce Connect to actually set up external objects and view it. So you'll see here, we've set up a few external objects here, archived accounts being one of them. And this is really just going to mirror the accounts object. If I go ahead and pull these up, we'll see in our list here, this is real time being pulled from the Postgres database. We see those 4 accounts that we just archived. I'm going to go ahead and click into Cervello United States, and you'll see all that data that was live in our Salesforce org is now in an archive state, but still viewable to me in Salesforce. And this is, a lot of this is Salesforce Connect functionality, but it is kind of important for the overall use case. So let me just show some additional capabilities that you can do with it. One of them in general is doing some, you can change the types of the data fields to lookups. So if you're storing Salesforce IDs in the fields, you can do some dynamic lookups just by changing the type on it. So you can see here, Cervello International, we're just storing the key of the parent that's currently live in Salesforce. But because we've changed the type, it's smart enough to do an actual lookup against that record. We can go ahead and then click into it. And one of the really cool things about it is you can then create related lists with these archived records. So, in scenarios where you're maybe archiving a bunch of transactions that relate to a parent that is still live in Salesforce, you could display all those transactions as related lists on that live parent record. So a lot of cool things to do there. One final thing that you can do is global search. And so if I was looking for my Cervello account, I can go ahead and type in Cervello across the top, and you'll see here it's pulling me back all records that are both live and in an archive state. So I still have a lot of visibility using Salesforce Connect into these archived records. So I kind of talked about in an archive state. The next step of this, we're now going to try to bring these records back into Salesforce. And really the difficult thing here is always making sure they're brought in the correct order. We're reestablishing relationships. They're all going to get new IDs. So there is some complexity there. Some of the things that are kind of out of our realm of control are obviously the IDs changing and any sort of system managed fields like potentially the created date or modified date. But everything else that's kind of a regular field or custom field that you've created, those will all come in just fine. So I'm going to come back to our bulk jobs manager here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply pull up my original config, and I'm just going to switch it to unarchiving. And I'm going to go ahead and save it. We'll see that it found one record that matched that condition. I'm going to come down here to my unarchiving job. I'm going to click the run job, and then go take a look at the job log ID, and we'll see that it's queued up. Unarchiving can take slightly longer, but not much longer, and it'll slowly rebuild the hierarchy. And while that's rebuilding, I'm going to jump back over to, I'm going to create a new tab for Cervello, the Cervello International account. And we should see, by the time that refreshes, if we take a look at our account hierarchy here, we'll see that it's already rebuilt our account structure. And when I click into it, we can see, should see it in a short second here, all the contacts. So you can see here my 3 contacts have been recreated back into Salesforce, part of my account that was archived. And we'll see the unarchiving job has completed with 4 accounts and 10 contacts, just with what we originally archived with. So that's pretty much the archiver soup to nuts from a user standpoint. As I mentioned, there's a whole Heroku component that we can walk through. And if you have any specific use cases on how you'd like to leverage the data in an archive state, we can definitely talk to that too. So
great. Thank you, Jason. So Haley, if you can maybe pass control back to me.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so before we get to some Q&A at the end, I just wanted to wrap up around some calls to actions and next steps. So again, if you want to submit some questions over, you have a few coming through now. We'll get to those in a moment. But just from a next steps perspective, if you want to know more about Heroku, there are some excellent assets available on Trailhead. So I picked out 3 here that I would highly recommend. So Heroku Enterprise Basics, a quick start around Heroku Connect, and then Salesforce and Heroku integration. So again, excellent resources, free to go through, and it allows you to, if you're interested in spinning up a Heroku environment, you can do that fairly quickly. In addition, if you happen to be going to Dreamforce this year, actually Jason and I will be doing a talk on this topic again. It will be a little bit probably more detailed when it comes to the technical aspects of how to do this, but certainly more than welcome to join us. So we're going to be, we believe this is the final location, but on the Wednesday of the conference in the developer zone, the developer theater. And then finally, you know, if you do have a need or around one of the use cases that we talked about earlier, you know, again, storage, performance, retention policies, regulatory, do not hesitate to reach out to us. So we're providing our contact information as a follow-up when we to the webinar. Our info will be in there in the subsequent materials provided, and so you can feel free to reach out to me directly. Again, Pete Graham, and we can set up some time to do a detailed discussion about your needs and your organization needs. So with that, let's do some Q&A. A couple questions are coming in here. So I think the first question, is this available in Salesforce Classic as well? Absolutely. Actually, for what we've done on that admin interface, again, very, very simple interfaces, those can be rendered in Classic. Actually, they were originally built in Classic. So all we've done there is just shown them in Lightning. So yes, available on both sides. And a lot of the features, regards like Salesforce Connect, again, are transferable between the two. Okay, next question. Do you have any guidelines around when an archiving solution makes sense? For example, data volume. Yeah. So, you know, most of our customers, I would say, start at between the 20 to 30 gigabyte of storage, but also growing rapidly. So we don't see where they're at that amount, and maybe they're, say, a customer for 5 to 10 years. What we see is, no, they might be a new customer. They've generated that amount of data based on their environment, and they're growing at some, you know, 25% rate of storage. So that from that above is where we see, you know, most of our use cases get applied. Okay, next questions. How do you manage changes to the objects, like new fields being added? So, and I think Jason may have touched upon this, but yeah, so it's clear that no Salesforce environment is static. So we recognize that new fields are being added to objects all the time. So yeah, it's a pretty simple process. So you would normally just add it as you would in your Salesforce environment. I think all you would need to do at that point is go into Heroku Connect and check off that new field to tell it to start synchronizing. That field would be fully synchronized over into Heroku Postgres. And then the next archiving routine, we pick up that change, we add it to the archive table structure, and then we'd start picking up records that have that field value populated. Another question we have here is it necessary to deploy the app to the Salesforce environment? So the interfaces, I think referring to the interfaces that Jason showed. Not necessarily. So no, I think what those interfaces do provide, though, is the configuration, obviously, and the rules. But technically, all the processing, and I think I showed this on maybe one of the early architecture slides. Everything we built is exposed via web services. So in theory, you could have a separate job or process that calls into the web service to start jobs, for example. It's possible. I think the only, you know, obviously it doesn't make it a very user-friendly, because a lot of that configuration is being done and stored inside of the Postgres structures. But again, not required. Next question was around, are there any limitations with Salesforce objects, and can you archive custom objects? So yes, you can definitely store You can definitely archive custom objects. And then as far as limitations on Salesforce objects, there are a few. A lot of those are dictated by Heroku Connect. I would say it's a very low number. And just to give you, I'll give you one example. The history objects that are associated with, say, any object, so like account history that's doing like field tracking changes, those objects are readable, they're not writable. And that's actually just a matter of the API, actually, not necessarily Heroku Connect. So what that means is we can archive that data, we just can't unarchive that data. So there are just a few, but for the most part, we have not run into any issues from an implementations perspective. Okay, and the next question we have here is, what does a typical implementation look like? How long? So yeah, as you saw from what we showed in the architecture, this is a fairly packaged solution from the perspective of we've tried to address 99% of the use cases that we would see. And so the time to get this up and running is actually fairly short, meaning we typically can get this solution in place somewhere between the time frame of 2 to 4 weeks. I'll caveat that a little bit because the complexity of implementation, meaning how many objects are we configuring, the data volumes that we're dealing with, the ability to have to define all the archiving rules. Sometimes that might take more time only because we need to gather those requirements. But as far as getting it up and running, we can do it, we can deploy the package fairly quickly and dive right in. And then we also expect to work fairly closely with our clients and customers to make sure validation is completed end-to-end in a sandbox environment. Once that's done, we'll move the entire application up into production, and then we'll begin that sort of initial tranche of archiving of the data. And then we move you into a steady state where you can then manage the jobs maybe to run on some frequency, maybe daily, monthly, weekly, and then obviously handing over the solution to you as the client to be able to own it and manage it on your own. And then you can fully extend it. So you might continue to evolve and extend this architecture and this solution to more objects within your org. Okay, so a couple more minutes here. Let's see, is your application managed package? No. So as Jason mentioned, both the interfaces that are deployed to Salesforce and obviously our application on the back end in Heroku, they're not an App Exchange app. So the reason for that is that we actually deliver this as a services engagement, primarily so that we allow the flexibility to extend if necessary, which is one of the things we've heard from our customers that they like is the fact that the application itself is not hidden from them. And so if we need to extend it, we can. And so we've kept it in that approach to date. Okay, and then I think it's the last question here. So what types of skills are needed to manage the application going forward? So as you saw in the demo that Jason showed, a lot of what we've built is driven off of configuration, so point and click, and trying to follow sort of the mantra of Salesforce here. So setting up Heroku Connect is actually point and click. Pick the objects, pick the fields, synchronize. Our configuration on the archiving side, point and click. Pick the objects, the child objects, define your archiving rules. I would say the most complex skill needed would be, aside from understanding the data model and your data and your org, would be being able to define that archiving rule. So it's a SQL statement. It can be a very simple SQL statement. We've had instances where that can be a little bit more complex than the example we showed. So SQL skills are helpful, but not necessarily required. And then the application itself is built on the Heroku Platform, is built in Java. So not necessary to have to know Java necessarily, but just from a back-end skills perspective, that's what the application is coded in. Okay. So I think those are all the questions. Blaine, I know, I think we're through everything. If you want to maybe wrap up and talk about next steps.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Peter. So I just wanted to send a quick reminder to those on the line. We will be sending out some follow-up materials for you to review. This webinar will be recorded and available to you if there's any further questions, obviously you can contact any one of us here, Peter, Jason, or myself, as well as for customers on the line, you can reach out to your account executive for questions as it relates specifically to your, to your business and to your use of Salesforce, and we can get connected that way as well. More details will also be sent out around Cervello's, presence at Dreamforce. So keep your eyes open for that. And with that being said, we want to say thank you for your time, and we look forward to assisting you. Have a great afternoon and great day.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Take care.